Cody Brown just admitted on camera that he made things up to control the situation. And once you hear what he said, everything about this story changes. This is the moment that exposes it all. So make sure you watch till the end, because the truth gets even more shocking. And if you want content that breaks down what others miss, hit subscribe right now, because you do not want to miss what comes next. Cody Brown just changed everything with one sentence. And the shocking part is not just what he said, but how easily he said it. Because there was no hesitation, no regret, no attempt to soften the impact. He simply admitted that he made things up, that he created rules that were never real, and used them in a moment where someone trusted him completely. And that moment now feels like a turning point, not just for the people involved, but for everyone watching. Because suddenly, years of conversations, decisions, and emotional reactions start to look different when seen through this new lens. And it all begins with a situation that at first seemed confusing, but not necessarily suspicious, until now, when the pieces are finally starting to connect. And what makes it even more intense is the timing, because this happened when Christine was already in the middle of one of the biggest transitions of her life. She was preparing to move forward, to step away from a structure that had defined her for decades. And just as she was building that independence, something unexpected was introduced into the situation. A claim that sounded serious, that sounded urgent, and that carried just enough authority to make it believable. And when someone has been part of your life for that long, when their voice has been part of every major decision, it becomes incredibly difficult to question them, even when something does not fully make sense. And that is exactly where the tension begins to build. Because on the surface, it appears like concern, like guidance, like someone trying to navigate a complicated situation. But underneath it, there is something else. Something that only becomes visible after the admission is made. And that is where everything shifts. Because now the focus is no longer just on what was said, but on why it was said and what it was meant to achieve in that moment. And when you go back and watch that interaction, knowing what we know now, the energy feels completely different. The pauses, the reactions, the uncertainty, it all carries a weight that was not obvious before. And that is what makes this so compelling, because it's not just about a single conversation. It's about the realization that a narrative was being shaped in real time. And that narrative influenced decisions, actions, and emotions in a way that might not have happened if the information had been clear from the beginning. And as that realization settles in, it opens the door to a much bigger question. If this could happen so openly in one moment, how many other moments were influenced in similar ways without being recognized? And that question alone is enough to keep people watching, to keep people analyzing, and to keep people coming back to re-examine everything they thought they understood. Because this is not just a revelation, it's a shift in perspective. And once that shift happens, it cannot be undone. It follows every scene, every conversation, every decision moving forward. And it creates a kind of tension that is hard to ignore. Because now there is always that underlying thought that what is being presented might not be the full picture. And that is where the suspense really begins to take hold. Because the story is no longer just unfolding in the present, it is also being rewritten in the past, as viewers connect dots that were previously scattered. And as those connections become clearer, the emotional impact grows stronger, because it is not just about what happened, it is about how it affected everyone involved, and how different things might have been if the truth had been there from the start. And that is what makes this moment feel so significant, because it is not loud or dramatic in the traditional sense. It is quiet. It is simple. It is a single statement delivered without hesitation, but its impact reaches far beyond that moment and continues to expand as more people begin to understand what it really means and why it matters so much. And as this understanding spreads, the conversation shifts from speculation to reflection, from confusion to clarity, and from isolated incidents to a broader pattern that is becoming harder and harder to ignore. And that is why this moment stands out, because it does not just reveal something new, it changes how everything else is seen. And that kind of shift does not happen often, but when it does, it leaves a lasting impression that reshapes the entire narrative moving forward. And once that shift happens, it becomes impossible to go back to the way things were seen before, because every interaction, every explanation, and every emotional moment starts to carry a different meaning, and what once felt like confusion now begins to look like something more intentional, and what once seemed like ordinary disagreements now feel layered with influence and control. And this is where the story deepens, because it is no longer about one moment. It is about a pattern that slowly reveals itself, piece by piece, as people start connecting the dots. And when those dots connect, they create a picture that is far more complex than anyone initially realized. And what makes this even more intense is that the pattern does not rely on loud, dramatic confrontations. It operates in subtle ways, through tone, through timing, through confidence, and through the ability to present something as unquestionable even when it is not. And that is what makes it so effective, because it does not immediately trigger resistance. Instead, it creates hesitation, it creates doubt, and it creates a situation where the other person feels like they need to adjust rather than challenge. And over time, those small adjustments add up. They shape decisions, they influence actions, and they build a narrative that feels real, even if it is not fully accurate. And this is where the emotional weight really begins to settle in. Because when people start to recognize that their understanding of certain situations may have been guided or influenced, it creates a sense of reevaluation, not just of events, but of trust itself. And that is not something that changes overnight. It is something that unfolds gradually as more moments are revisited and reinterpreted. And as that process continues, it becomes clear that this was not about a single instance of miscommunication, but about a repeated approach that worked because it was consistent and because it was rarely questioned in real time. And now that it is being questioned, everything feels different, because the same words, the same explanations, and the same reactions no longer carry the same credibility. And that shift changes the dynamic completely. Because once credibility is challenged, the balance of influence begins to shift as well. And that is exactly what we are seeing now. A shift in how people respond, a shift in how they process information, and a shift in how they define their own boundaries. And what makes this so compelling to watch is that it is happening in real time. It is not a single dramatic reveal followed by a resolution. It is an ongoing process where each new realization adds another layer to the story, and each new perspective challenges what came before. And as that continues, the tension builds, not because of what might happen next, but because of what is being understood now, and how that understanding is reshaping everything. And this is where the narrative becomes less about conflict and more about clarity. Because the more clarity there is, the harder it becomes for any one version of events to dominate without question. And that is where real change begins, because clarity leads to confidence, and confidence leads to decisions that are no longer based on uncertainty or pressure, but on a clearer sense of reality. And that transformation is powerful, because it represents a shift from being influenced to being aware. And once that awareness is there, it cannot simply disappear. It stays, it informs future interactions, it shapes future choices, and it creates a new foundation that is very different from what existed before. And that is why this part of the story matters so much, because it shows the transition from confusion to understanding, from influence to independence, and from a controlled narrative to a more balanced perspective. And as this transition continues, it becomes clear that the impact of that original admission extends far beyond the moment it was made. It continues to echo through every conversation, every reflection, and every decision that follows. And it serves as a reminder that even the smallest statements can have far-reaching consequences when they reveal something deeper about how situations have been shaped over time. And that is what keeps people engaged. Not just the details of what happened, but the process of uncovering what it all means and how it changes everything moving forward. And now the truth is finally out. One admission changed everything and exposed a pattern no one can ignore anymore. But this story is still unfolding, so if you want the real breakdowns and updates before anyone else, hit subscribe right now, because the next reveal might be even bigger.